Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we're going to talk about Chapter 5. We'll focus on the supply of labor, specifically on the hours of work that individuals decide to work. So we're going to explore some of the issues about the supply of labor. We're not going to go into Chapter 4 and cover the labor force participation rate. That's more of a macroeconomic variable. We want to focus on what we call microeconomic variables, things that are going on within the firm, because that's going to be much more applicable for someone going into HR. So we'll talk about how workers make decisions about whether they want to work and how many hours they want to work. So in this chapter, we're going to discuss the trend of hours over time. So how long people used to work in the past, how long we decide to work today, the theory behind the supply of working hours, how we work, and we're going to end with a brief discussion on some related policy issues. So it's easy to take for granted the typical 8-hour workday that we have today, but in the past, this always wasn't the case. We don't have reliable statistics for the 1800s. It's obviously hard to go back now and look at, and people didn't record a lot of this at the time. But it was common for people to work 16 hours, and only 17 or 18 hours in a day was considered abusive, which it seems like quite a bit today. That's kind of crazy to think about if you imagine yourself working 16, 17, 18 hours a day. That means you only had time to sleep after work, and you couldn't even get a full 8 hours of sleep if you were working 17 or 18 hours. Even worse, people worked on Saturdays too. It wasn't just Monday to Friday. So really, you only had Sunday, and many things were closed on Sunday. So anything you needed to get done during the week, incredibly difficult to do. In the 1840s, the work week was about 70 hours in England, just a little bit under, 78 hours in the US, and 80 hours a week in Germany. So the graph here on the slide shows the average hours worked per year going back to the 1870s. Since World War II, we've seen a slight decline to about 1,750 hours per year, or about 34 hours per week. So this is much lower than the 1800s. Now, John Maynard Keynes noticed this trend in the 1930s, and in 1930, he wrote Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. And in this, he predicted that we'd be working just about 15 hours per week today, given the trends that that he was seeing at the time. His idea was basically that as people became more productive in their work, they would choose to work fewer hours and maintain a similar or slightly better lifestyle. Basically, once you met all the needs that you had in the 1930s, people would choose to stop working and enjoy themselves and their family and friends and all that, rather than keep working to get more and more stuff. We haven't seen that. Instead, we've seen people continue to work these full weeks, or closer to what a full week was back then. Today in the US, we work more hours than other developed countries as well, and especially our peers in Europe. Some think this is a bad thing, that we can have much more time to relax or take week-long vacations like they do in Europe, but others would say it's a good thing. Our businesses are more productive and more innovative, and we don't have to wait so long as consumers for the goods and services that we need to buy. As we often say in economics, there are trade-offs. So there are some good things about our longer work week than places like Europe, and there are some downsides to that as well. So worker preferences have shaped the length of the work week. That shouldn't really be a surprise to us. Workers have more desire for leisure than they did in the past. And I want to note, when economists refer to leisure, especially labor economists, we mean just not work. So all things outside of work that we're not getting paid for. So it could be taking care of kids, which is often work in its own right. It takes a lot of effort to do that, but it's not paid work we're getting. It could be hobbies, so something that we do that's like active or requires focus on our part, but it's for fun. It's not something we get paid for again. It could refer to volunteer work, or it could be laying around and watching TV. It could be going on vacation. All these sorts of things count as leisure. So a change in desire for any of these things would change worker demand for what we are referring to as leisure. So the question is not whether the changes in the work week reflect workers' preferences. For many, the interesting question is how those preferences became adopted. How do we see this develop over time and this desire for leisure change? Some credit the market that over time, firms had to reduce the hours that they had their workers working in order to track those that they wanted. Others credit things like labor unions that represented workers and legislation and regulation that was designed to protect workers. One argument that some make, that with a growing population, of course the hours per week is going to fall because there are more people around there's just not enough work to go around. And people would be out of work if they were still working, those 60, 70-hour work weeks we saw with that in the past. But there's a problem with this. This idea falsely assumes that the number of jobs in an economy is flat, rather than growing with the economy as it grows. More people result in a higher demand for goods and services, and as a result, more jobs to create that additional output. We call this idea that there's only a certain amount of work to go around the lump of labor fallacy. So it's very easy to fall into this trap. A lot of people do it. Sometimes I'll even do it before I stop for a second to think about what's going on. So it's definitely worth highlighting here. Even if you don't take away, a lot of these like theories we talk about, if you can remember a few common pitfalls that people fall into like this, I think the class will be worth it. So during recessions, some people will call for shortening the work week temporarily, to spread the work around. So we don't need to fire as many workers. So firms can hold on to them because remember, there's only so much to go around. Other people worry about immigration because, more immigrants come to the country, they take away jobs for Americans. In both cases, what we're assuming is a fixed amount of labor, even though in reality it can grow or it can shrink. I included a link to the St. Louis Fed's article about the lump labor fallacy in this module for you to read more about if you are interested and care to read more about it, but it's not required for you guys. Now, how workers' preferences are able to determine the work week isn't something direct. It's not very often, although some jobs you can, but very rare that you can walk in your boss's office and say, I'm only working 30 hours this week, but I'm getting the full amount paid to me for my work week. But those who are self-employed are their own boss, so they can choose how many hours they want to work. Typically, this is going to be more than 40 hours per week. They're going to choose to work a lot more to make sure that their company that they're running is doing well. Some jobs and industries have typical work weeks that are based on what you get done rather than how many hours you work. Some jobs are more intense or dangerous, so they limit the hours that people work at one time for safety. Things like independent contractors, all the way from Uber drivers to like consultant-style jobs, can choose exactly how many hours they want to work. Many choose overtime. So people in a lot of different jobs will choose to work overtime for that extra pay. Although some are more forced, it's, everyone in the company works overtime. I've worked jobs like that before. Some people choose to moonlight with a second job. I even had a friend who, when a coworker got fired, said to their bosses, give me a 25% raise instead of hiring a new worker. I'll just take over their job. And he worked like an extra hour a day and got paid that extra money because he was fulfilling basically two roles, but because there was so much overlap, he didn't actually have to do that much extra work. So there's a lot of different ways that workers are able to choose the hours that they work. Obviously, it's going to be easier to work longer hours than it is going to be to work shorter hours. But over time, in many industries, we've seen that downward trend in hours worked as people want to have more time for leisure, more time for hobbies, for fun things, for family responsibilities, for just being able to have fun with other people and develop those personal connections. There's considerable flexibility in working schedules that we don't imagine at first glance. And again, this is over the long term, maybe not in like the short term. And like this week you can't walk in and make huge changes in your working schedule, but over a long period of time we basically are able to. And we've seen that workers are the ones leading this change. So there's an old joke that economists look at something going on in the real world and they say, okay, so it works in practice, but does it work in theory? Basically, we're going to turn this joke into real life now, and we're going to explore the theory behind the labor supply decision of individuals, what we see going on in real life, to try to understand what's happening. So let's turn to the figure on the right of this slide to see how this is going to work. So now our x-axis is going to be time. Everything to the left of L1 is leisure. Everything to the right of L1 is work. Now, obviously, it's going to be split up into 24 hours because there's 24 hours in a day. If it's based on the week, it's going to be, all the hours that are in a week. If it's a year, it's going to be all the hours within the year. But it's going to be split between leisure and work. Everything that's not work is going to be categorized as leisure. The y-axis is going to be income. So now the downward sloping line we see from point C to point A is the wage that a worker is going to earn. As we move farther to the left, the worker is going to work more hours. They're going to earn a higher income. As we move to the right, they earn a lower income, and the worker works fewer hours, spending more time in leisure. So the U3 curve, or the three U curves are labeled U. So U1, U2, and U3. These are the utility curves, the amount of enjoyment that an individual gets from the mix of work and leisure that they choose. We also call them indifference curves, and that's why I'm going to be referring to them as primarily, because an individual is indifferent between their two choices anywhere along that curve. They get the same amount of utility anywhere on that specific indifference curve. So an individual is going to choose a mix of work and leisure where that indifference curve is tangent to the wage line. When we say tangent, we mean that it touches in one and only one spot on the wage line. So in this case, at point D, the indifference curve U2 is tangent to the wage line. So that's the point that they're going to be working at. That's where they're going to choose to work. If we look at curve U1, that indifference curve, it crosses at point B, and it's going to cross higher up near the top. So there's going to be 2 points where it crosses the wage line. So an individual on indifference curve U1 could move to indifference curve U2 and improve their utility. At every point on indifference curve U2 is going to give the individual more utility than any point on indifference curve U1. Now, any point on the indifference curve U3, in this case, is going to be impossible. And that's because that curve U3 does not touch the wage line that we see. So although for moving from U2 to U3, an individual worker could improve their utility, they can make themselves better off, they can better meet their needs. There is no way for them to do it at the current wage it's being offered. And note that these indifference curves never intersect. They're going to be like parallel to each other. That's important to remember, that these curves are never going to be able to touch each other. So now what's going to happen if a worker's non-labor income increases? So let's say the worker has investments in real estate that rapidly increase in value. That it's their home, and their home is in a really hot market at that time. Value of their home increases substantially. This will allow individuals to jump to a higher indifference curve. So before U3 was impossible, but now the worker can reach it. So in the figure on the right, I guess the figure in the middle here, we have an increase in wages, or an increase in the non-wage income, which is represented by the wage line shifting outward. So at every choice of hour work, the worker will receive a higher overall income than before. And that's because they're getting this higher non-wage income, but it's always going to be the same no matter where they are along the line. So because of that, the two wage lines are parallel. So in this case, when the non-wage income increases, the worker is going to increase their amount of leisure. We can see point G on the indifference curve U3 is going to be where the indifference curve is tangent to the new wage line. So if we trace the point G down to the x-axis, we can see that the hours of leisure are going to increase and the hours worked are going to decrease. However, the worker is still going to make more money than before because they have that non-wage income that they're getting as well. Now, this may seem counterintuitive at first. The reason why this happens and our workers are going to shift into more leisure is because we can think of leisure as a normal good. What we mean by normal goods is that when people's income increases, they're going to desire more of it. Basically, pretty much any good you can imagine is going to be a normal good. There are also what's called inferior goods, and that's when people's income increases, they demand less of it. That's going to be things like secondhand clothing from thrift stores, like cheap ramen noodles. Once you start earning more money, you're not going to want to buy those products as much. Most products, when your income goes up, you're going to want to buy more of it. So the increase in income, changing worker desired hours, this is called the income effect. Now, what happens really depends on how workers see work and leisure. For some, work may provide some utility. So I'm thinking of things like some high status jobs like pro athletes or CEOs, something I've mentioned a couple times before already. So it's not always going to be the case that we're going to see the hours worked decrease when workers make more money. So let's look at a more concrete example of this. What happens when the wage rates increase? So instead of getting this one lump sum, an increase by a certain amount all the way across the the hours work spectrum. Now what we're doing is increasing the wage rate. So it's going to, instead of just shift up the entire curve, it's going to kind of turn it up. So when the worker works 0 hours, it's going to stay at that same point. In this case, on this graph, point B. But now with the whole, as we go on and work more and more hours, it's going to shift up higher and higher, and it's steeper. So when wages increase, that makes leisure more expensive. What I mean by being more expensive is that you have to forego more money for the same amount of leisure in this case. So this may mean that people will desire less leisure with higher wages. When that happens, we call this the substitution effect. So you're going to have both the income effect and the substitution effect going on at the same time when you have the hourly wages increase. So here's a figure from the textbook showing an increase in the wage rate. When the total income increases, the entire curve shifts up at every point by the same amount, like I said. But now that the wage rate increases, the more hours a person works, the greater their gains are. So this will have a somewhat different effect than what we just saw. The line BC in this figure was the original wage. Now with the new wage after the raise, it's BE. So the worker is going to choose a mix of work and leisure, in this case at point H, which is tangent to the indifference curve U2. Because we see this increase in the wage rate, we're changing that line. We're now moving out from the previous indifference curve, U1, to a higher indifference curve, U2. So the hours of leisure in this case are going to increase from L1 to L3. So what we see is fewer hours are going to be worked and more hours of leisure for this worker. Now, this might not be what you expected. We might expect people to want to take advantage of the ability to make even more money. But we have both the income effect and the substitution effect going on simultaneously. So we can also explore how these two interact with each other. So let's start with the worker's new labor leisure decision, point H. We can then shift down the new wage rate so that it's tangent with the difference curve U1. This is represented by the dotted line going from G to F. So it's the same slope as the new wage rate. It's just shifted back down so that it's tangent with the previous indifference curve. So now the worker, if this was their wage, this is not ever being offered to them, but this is, if it was being offered to them, they would choose at point I. So they're going along the indifference curve back towards and working fewer hours or having less leisure and working more hours. So that would be, yes, like I said, at point I. Now, the difference between B and G, or E and F, is how much the wage increase is valued by the worker, how much they value that increase. The horizontal difference between point H and point I, so that's between L2 and L3 on the x-axis, is going to be the income effect, or basically how much more leisure the worker demands because of the higher income that they're receiving. The horizontal difference between I and D, or the difference between L1 and L2 on the x-axis, is going to be the substitution effect. So the substitution effect holds the utility constant, meaning we're going back to the same indifference curve that we were originally at. So we can use this to see the effect of the relative wage rate on the number of hours of leisure that an individual prefers. So in this example, we can see that the income effect increases the hours of leisure the worker might prefer, so moving L to the right. On the other hand, the substitution effect increases the hours of work that are preferred by workers, moving L to the left. In this example we're looking at now, the income effect is larger than the substitution effect, but that's not necessarily the case. In the real world, the opposite can be true as well. If you look at figure 5.5 in your textbook, which I didn't include in these slides, you can see where the substitution effect outweighs the income effect. So we have the opposite overall effect from a change in the wage rates going on. So what's going to determine which one holds? Unfortunately, there's no hard and fast rules for that. We're not going to be able to tell ex ante what's going on. It's up to each individual's tastes and preferences. So maybe the individual enjoys work. They do get some utility, some meaning from their work. Maybe they want more money to save up for a house. Maybe they want more money for their family and for their children. Then we'd see the hours of work increase. But maybe that person has everything they want. They're content with their material level of living. So now they just want to relax. They want to enjoy their friends and their family. For that person, we'd see the hours of work decrease. And we would see them with different indifference curves than the person that, was saving up for a house or want more money for their family. So again, just to review this, because I might have went through a little bit too quickly at the time, the income effect is going to be the horizontal difference in the previous example between point I and H. So basically above a certain wage rate, as the wage rate rises, workers can afford to work fewer hours while maintaining the same level of income, their same standard of living. So workers are going to end up with more leisure. Now the substitution effect, remember this is the horizontal distance between points I and D in our previous example. So as the wage rate rises, workers are willing to work more hours and they substitute away from their leisure time because now the opportunity cost of the leisure rises with the higher wages, therefore going an even greater amount of money by taking advantage of leisure. So instead, they'll end up working more because it's relatively more expensive. And we're going to continue working with this simple model in the next section.